The ballroom had gone quiet. Marion Bennett stood only inches from her oldest daughter, her face twisted with disgust as dozens of wedding guests watched. "You couldn't even do one thing right," she snapped loud enough for every table to hear. "Your own sister's wedding, and you show up alone looking like this." Joyce lowered her eyes. "Mom, today's about Emily. Please don't do this." "Oh, don't tell me what today is about." Marion took another step forward. "It's about family, and you're the biggest disappointment this family has ever produced." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the room. Joyce turned slightly, hoping she could simply walk away before the humiliation became worse. Marion grabbed her wrist. "I wasn't finished." Joyce gently tried to pull free. That was when Marion slapped her. The sharp sound echoed through the reception hall. Several guests gasped. Others laughed awkwardly, assuming it was another dramatic family moment. Marion pointed directly at Joyce. "I wish you had never been born." No one moved. Not Joyce's aunts. Not her uncles. Not even her younger sister, still standing in her white wedding dress only a few feet away. Joyce slowly raised her hand to her burning cheek. Instead of answering her mother, she looked toward the entrance. Someone in the crowd noticed. "Still waiting for that imaginary boyfriend," one cousin muttered. Another guest smirked. "I guess even he finally gave up." None of them noticed the tiny, almost invisible change in Joyce's expression, as though she had just realized the waiting was finally over. Joyce had spent the entire morning helping everyone except herself. She had arranged floral deliveries after the florist was delayed. She had calmed nervous vendors. She had driven across town to collect forgotten wedding favors. When Emily's veil was accidentally damaged, Joyce quietly repaired it before anyone else even realized there had been a problem. No one thanked her. By the time family photographs began, everyone simply assumed Joyce would continue solving problems without ever becoming part of the celebration herself. She wore a simple navy dress instead of the expensive designer gowns many of the guests had chosen. That alone had been enough for Marion. "Look at your sister," Marion had announced earlier while adjusting Emily's train. "Graceful, successful, elegant." Then she glanced toward Joyce. "And then there's, whatever this is." Several relatives laughed politely, more interested in pleasing Marion than questioning her. Joyce had heard those comparisons her entire life. Emily was the daughter everyone proudly introduced. Joyce was the daughter whose achievements somehow never counted. When Joyce started her own architectural restoration consulting business, Marion dismissed it as playing with old buildings. When Joyce bought her own apartment without asking for help, Marion told relatives it was probably too small to mention. Whenever Joyce tried introducing someone she was dating, Marion found reasons they weren't good enough. Eventually, Joyce stopped bringing anyone home at all. Silence had become easier than defending herself. After the slap, however, something felt different. She reached beneath the neckline of her dress, briefly touching the chain hidden beneath the fabric. The wedding ring, resting against her heart, steadied her breathing. She wasn't alone. She hadn't been alone for 3 years. She simply hadn't told anyone. Across the room, the wedding coordinator suddenly froze. Her eyes shifted toward the grand entrance. Then she hurried across the marble floor, whispering urgently to one of the venue staff. Guests instinctively turned to see what had captured her attention. Joyce looked toward the doors one more time. This time, she didn't look afraid. She looked certain. Joyce kept her eyes on the entrance, but the doors remained closed. Around her, conversations slowly resumed as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Glasses clinked. Soft music drifted through the ballroom. The only reminder of what had just happened was the faint red mark still visible on her cheek. Marion folded her arms. "Well," she said with a smug smile, "I thought someone was coming." Several cousins laughed. "I think she was waiting for a miracle," one of them whispered. Joyce said nothing. She had learned years ago that defending herself only gave her mother a larger audience. Instead, she slipped one hand beneath the neckline of her dress and closed her fingers around the chain hidden there. The cool metal settled her racing heartbeat. Hidden beneath the fabric was the wedding ring she had worn every day for the past 3 years. No one in that room knew it existed. Not even Emily. That morning had begun very differently. Joyce stood in the foyer of the home she shared with Ethan, fastening a pair of simple earrings while checking the time. Ethan stepped into the hallway, adjusting the cuff of his navy jacket. "You don't have to do this alone," he said gently. Joyce looked up. "I know." "Then let me come with you." She walked over and straightened his tie, offering the small smile he knew often hid anxiety. "It's Emily's wedding. So, I don't want today becoming about us." Ethan studied her face. "You think your mother will behave?" Joyce hesitated. "I think she'll find something to criticize. Then all the more reason I should be there." She slowly shook her head. "If you come, she'll spend the whole day trying to make you leave. And if I don't, she'll focus on me." Neither answer sounded good. Ethan sighed before taking both of her hands. "I hate watching you walk into that family by yourself. I've handled it before. That's exactly what worries me." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Ethan nodded. "I'll respect your decision." Joyce leaned forward and hugged him tightly. "If anything changes." She didn't finish. He already knew. As she headed toward the front door earlier that morning, Ethan called after her. "Promise me one thing." She turned. "If you need me, don't protect anyone else's feelings." Joyce smiled faintly. "I promise. And if you call." "I know. I'll come." She had believed she could survive one more family gathering. She had been wrong. Back in the ballroom, Marian wasn't finished. She lifted her champagne glass toward a nearby group of relatives. "You know," she said loudly, "Joyce always thought she was too good for everyone." One aunt nodded eagerly. "I remember when she refused that accountant you introduced." Marian laughed. "Refused, please." She looked directly at Joyce. No man ever stayed long enough for her to refuse. Several guests chuckled. Another relative joined in. "Didn't she move 3 times because she couldn't keep a relationship?" Marian smiled with satisfaction. "I stopped trying to keep track." Joyce stared at them in disbelief. None of those stories were true. She hadn't moved because of failed relationships. She had moved closer to restoration projects. She hadn't rejected people out of arrogance. She had simply stopped introducing anyone after watching her mother tear every relationship apart. Listening to them now, Joyce realized something that hurt almost as much as the slap. Her mother hadn't merely criticized her over the years. She had rewritten her entire life. And everyone had believed her. Without lifting her head, Joyce reached into her small handbag beneath the table where no one could see. She unlocked her phone. Her fingers hovered over one conversation. There was only one message she needed to send. "Please come now." She pressed send. Almost instantly, the phone vibrated in her hand. Her breath caught. She opened the reply. Only 4 words appeared on the screen. "I'm already outside." Joyce barely had time to lower her phone before the ballroom doors opened. The conversations around the room softened, not because anyone recognized the man entering, but because his calm, deliberate stride naturally drew attention. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't looking around uncertainly. He walked with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly why he was there. Dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, Ethan Lawson stepped into the reception hall and paused just long enough to take in the room. His eyes found Joyce immediately. The faint mark on her cheek stopped him for a fraction of a second. Then he continued toward her. Marian noticed him approaching and gave an exaggerated laugh. "Well, everyone," she announced. "Looks like Joyce actually convinced someone to show up." A few relatives smirked. "So that's the mysterious boyfriend. Took him long enough." Marian folded her arms. "I hope you at least rented a decent suit." Ethan didn't acknowledge any of them. He stopped directly in front of Joyce. Without saying a word, he gently brushed a strand of hair away from her face and examined the redness on her cheek. His expression remained calm. Only his eyes changed. "Are you hurt?" he asked quietly. Joyce shook her head. "No." He looked at her for another moment. "You don't have to protect anyone." She swallowed hard. "I know." Only then did Ethan slowly turn toward the crowd. His voice remained steady. "Who touched my wife?" The words seemed to steal the air from the room. Nobody laughed. Nobody moved. Several guests looked from Ethan to Joyce and back again. One cousin frowned. "Did he just say, wife?" Emily's bouquet lowered slightly in her hands. Her father blinked in confusion. Even Marian looked caught off guard before recovering with an amused smile. "Oh, please." She waved dismissively. "This is exactly the kind of attention-seeking stunt I'd expect." She looked directly at Joyce. "So now you've hired someone to pretend you're married." A few uncertain laughs followed, but they were noticeably weaker than before. Ethan met Marian's eyes. "My name is Ethan Lawson." He offered nothing else. No explanation. No speech. Just his name. For a moment, it meant nothing to most of the family. Then one of the wedding vendors froze. The venue manager, who had been speaking with the catering staff, suddenly looked over with obvious surprise. Another contractor whispered to the photographer. "That's Ethan Lawson. The developer. The one restoring the Grand Wellington Hotel. I worked on one of his projects last year." The whispers spread faster than anyone expected. Several guests quietly searched their memories. The name sounded familiar. One businessman seated near the front narrowed his eyes before quietly standing. "I've met him before." His wife looked confused. "You have?" "At a preservation fundraiser." His expression changed completely. "That's definitely Ethan Lawson." The atmosphere shifted almost instantly. The same people who had laughed at Joyce moments earlier now looked uncertain. Marian noticed it too. She refused to give up control. "This proves absolutely nothing." She stepped closer. "Anyone can claim to be someone's husband." She pointed at Joyce. "If you're really married, where's the proof?" Joyce didn't answer. She simply looked at Ethan. He smiled softly. Without a word, he slipped his wedding band from his finger. Then he reached toward Joyce. She understood immediately. For the first time in 3 years, she lifted the chain from around her neck. The ring hidden beneath her dress slid into her hand. Gasps echoed across the ballroom. Ethan placed his ring beside hers on the nearest table. The two bands matched perfectly. He turned them over together. Engraved inside both rings were the same words. "Forever, October 14." Silence settled over the reception. No one could laugh anymore. For several long seconds, no one spoke. The ballroom that had been filled with laughter only moments earlier now felt painfully still. Guests stared at the matching rings lying side by side on the table. Emily slowly lowered herself into a nearby chair. I didn't know," she whispered. Joyce looked at her sister with tired eyes. "I know." Marian was the first to break the silence. "This doesn't change anything." Her voice was louder than before, almost desperate. "So you're married. Fine. But why would anyone hide a marriage unless they were ashamed of it?" She looked around the room, searching for agreement. "This whole thing is ridiculous." Ethan calmly picked up the rings and placed Joyce's back into her hand. "No," he said evenly, It was necessary. Marian laughed bitterly. Necessary. Yes. He looked directly at her. Because Joyce knew exactly what would happen if you found out. The words landed harder than he intended. Several relatives exchanged uneasy glances. Joyce lowered her eyes. I wasn't hiding from anyone else, she said quietly. I was protecting my marriage. Ethan turned toward Joyce's father. Mr. Bennett. Richard looked up, still visibly overwhelmed. I'm sorry. He frowned. Have we met? We have. Richard searched his face but couldn't place him. Ethan smiled politely. Not officially. Confusion spread across Richard's face. I don't understand. 2 years ago, your bank was preparing foreclosure paperwork. Richard's expression froze. Only a handful of people had ever known how close they had come to losing the family home. You remember receiving a letter saying the mortgage had been settled through a private trust. Richard slowly nodded. We never found out who. Ethan finished the sentence for him. I established that trust. The room erupted into stunned whispers. Richard stared at him. You. Ethan nodded once. But it wasn't my idea. He looked at Joyce. She asked me to help. Joyce immediately shook her head. I didn't want anyone to know. Richard looked back and forth between them. You saved our home. Joyce answered softly. It wasn't just my home. Tears welled in Richard's eyes. And you never told us. Joyce gave a sad smile. Would Mom have believed me? Richard couldn't answer. Marian stepped forward again. No. She pointed accusingly at Ethan. I don't believe any of this. Ethan calmly reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. I expected that. He removed a slim document folder. Without any dramatic flourish, he handed it to Richard. Inside were copies of the trust agreement, payment confirmations, and legal correspondence documenting the mortgage settlement. Every page listed the same beneficiary. Richard Bennett. Every authorization traced back to the same private trust. Richard's hands trembled as he turned each page. It's all here, he whispered. One uncle leaned over to look. So it really happened. Another relative quietly shook his head. And Joyce never took credit. The truth began spreading from table to table. Not through rumors this time. Through evidence. Emily slowly stood. She looked at Joyce, tears streaming down her face. Was it true? Joyce looked confused. What? Emily's voice cracked. Did you really cancel vacations, work weekends, and turn down projects because you kept helping us? Joyce hesitated. I did what family does. Emily covered her mouth. I thought Mom was exaggerating when she said you were selfish. Joyce didn't respond. She didn't have to. The silence answered for her. One cousin looked down in embarrassment. I remember borrowing money from Joyce. Another added quietly. She paid for Grandma's medication one winter. I thought Mom had done that, someone else admitted. No, Joyce said gently. I just didn't think it mattered who paid. The room changed. People weren't simply discovering Ethan's identity. They were realizing how completely Marian had rewritten Joyce's place in the family. Marian looked around the room, suddenly finding no one willing to support her. This is all an attempt to humiliate me. No, Ethan replied calmly. You accomplished that yourself. For the first time all evening, Marian had no response. She took a step toward Joyce. You're not leaving like this. She reached for her daughter's arm. Joyce instinctively stepped backward, creating just enough distance that Marian's hand closed on empty air. Their eyes met. Joyce's voice remained calm. Steady. Certain. You don't get to touch me ever again. The words settled over the ballroom with more force than the slap had. Marian's hand slowly fell back to her side. For the first time in anyone's memory, she had been publicly told no by the daughter she had controlled for decades. No one rushed to defend her. No one told Joyce she was overreacting. The silence itself had become a verdict. Joyce took a slow breath. "I never wanted today to become about me," she said, looking first at Emily before addressing the rest of the room. "That's why Ethan stayed away." Several guests listened without interrupting. "I've hidden my marriage for 3 years, not because I was ashamed of my husband." She glanced at Ethan and smiled faintly. "But because I knew exactly what would happen if my mother found out." Marian scoffed. "You expect everyone to believe that." Joyce met her mother's eyes. "Every man I ever introduced was criticized before you even knew him." She paused. "You question their jobs, their families, their intentions." She looked around the room. Some of them stopped calling because they couldn't handle the constant attacks. A few older relatives exchanged uncomfortable looks. "I finally met someone who loved me without trying to change me," Joyce continued. "The one thing I couldn't risk was letting that happiness become another target." Ethan reached over and gently took her hand. "So we made a decision together," he said. "We would tell people when Joyce felt safe enough to do it." Joyce gave a small, bittersweet smile. "I kept thinking that day would come." She looked around the reception hall. "Today showed me it never would have." Richard Bennett slowly walked toward his oldest daughter. His shoulders, usually straight with quiet pride, now seemed heavy. When he stopped in front of Joyce, his voice barely carried across the room. "I'm sorry." Joyce looked at him but said nothing. "I saw too much," he admitted, "and I convinced myself that staying quiet would keep peace in the family." A tear slipped down his cheek. "It didn't." He shook his head. "It only left you standing there alone." For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Richard opened his arms. Joyce hesitated only briefly before embracing her father. It wasn't a perfect ending to years of pain, but it was an honest beginning. Across the room, Emily stepped forward next. She had removed her bouquet and handed it to one of her bridesmaids. "I owe you an apology, too." Joyce looked at her younger sister. "I spent years believing everything Mom said." Emily's voice cracked. "I thought you stayed away because you didn't care." Joyce gently shook her head. "I stayed away because every visit became another fight." Emily wiped away tears. "You still helped me." Joyce smiled softly. "You were my sister." Emily broke down completely. "I'm so sorry." The sisters embraced, while many guests quietly looked away, ashamed of having laughed earlier. One by one, relatives began speaking. "I believed stories that weren't true." "I never asked Joyce her side." "I should have thanked you years ago." Even the cousin who had mocked Joyce's imaginary boyfriend lowered his head. "I was wrong." Joyce accepted the apologies without anger, but she didn't pretend the past had disappeared. Some wounds healed slowly. Some relationships never fully recovered. She understood the difference now. Marian remained standing alone near the head table. People who had spent years seeking her approval quietly drifted away. Conversations that once centered around pleasing her now happened without her. The respect she had demanded had vanished because everyone had finally seen what it had cost. In the weeks that followed, videos recorded by wedding guests spread through the extended family. The footage showed the slap. It showed Marian saying she wished Joyce had never been born. It showed Ethan arriving. Most importantly, it showed Joyce refusing to retaliate. Friends who had admired Marian's polished public image began keeping their distance. Several charitable boards quietly chose not to renew her leadership roles after learning how she had treated her own daughter. Business acquaintances, who valued integrity more than appearances, stopped returning her calls. Her influence didn't disappear overnight. It simply faded as people lost trust in the person behind the reputation. Joyce never celebrated any of it. She had never wanted revenge. She had wanted freedom. She and Ethan agreed on one decision before leaving the reception. They would no longer attend family gatherings where respect was optional. Months passed. Autumn arrived. The restoration of an elegant 19th-century home overlooking a quiet river was finally complete. It became Joyce and Ethan's home. Warm wood floors. Sunlight pouring through restored stained glass windows. Shelves filled with architectural drawings and photographs from projects they had completed together. One Sunday afternoon, they hosted a simple family dinner. There were no extravagant decorations, no speeches, no performances. Only the people who had sincerely apologized and worked to rebuild trust received invitations. Richard came early carrying homemade bread. Emily arrived with her husband and quietly hugged Joyce before anyone else. Laughter filled the dining room naturally, without anyone competing for attention. For the first time, Joyce experienced something she had spent years believing might never exist. Peace. As the evening came to an end, she stood beside the front window with Ethan. She reached beneath the neckline of her blouse. The familiar chain was still there. Slowly, she unclasped it. The wedding ring that had rested hidden against her heart for 3 years caught the warm light. Ethan smiled. No more hiding. Joyce looked down at the ring. No more hiding. She slipped it back onto her finger, where it belonged. This time, she had no reason to conceal it. She wasn't afraid of judgment anymore. She wasn't waiting for permission to live her own life. She had finally learned that family isn't defined by the people who demand your silence. It's defined by the people who protect your voice. Joyce looked at Ethan, intertwined her fingers with his, and together they closed the front door on the past. She realized that the greatest revenge was never arriving with a wealthy husband. It was finally walking away from the people who believed she would always accept being treated as less.